I'm Steve Hirschhorn, or Steve H, as some people would call me, and this is Gallery Teachers Masterclass, and it's called Observation and Feedback for the Woke. Now, you might think that's a strange way to begin this session, but my aim here is to speak to teachers and those in authority, that is, directors of studies and so on, and try to begin the process of changing the way we think about observation and feedback. Before we start, let's just take a moment to define this much abused word, woke. For me, a definition of today's usage must include being aware of and acting to counter injustice. Now, I include here the injustice of being made to cry after being observed in a professional context. That's my starting point today. Let's just cycle back a little and have a look at what we mean by observation. Here is a definition from a well-known publication from 1997. Clinical supervision, which we define as the process by which teaching performance is systematically observed, analyzed, and evaluated. This is Bowers, Richards, and Noonan, of course. I'm sure most of you read it, probably seen that, probably skipped over it. Don't give it too much thought. Why would you? So observation is technically known as clinical supervision. And that's really, that is the starting point for everything that I'm going to do, everything I'm going to say and talk about today. Now, here are some questions which I asked people to answer before this session. If you can put in the chat box your answers as we go along, that'd be great. If you can't for some reason, that's also fine. They're really for you, but also I think quite interesting for others to see how you've answered these questions. So how many times you've been observed in the last 12 months? Perhaps we can talk about how many times you need to be observed at some point during this session. And number 2 is on a rating from 1 to 10, where 10 is the maximum and 1 is the minimum. How useful do you find observation? And then number 3, would you like more or less observation over the next 12 months? I reckon I know the answer to that. And number 4, how much warning would you like before being observed? This, of course, is quite a contentious question, this last one, because there are teachers who say, oh, I must be prepared. I have to know who's coming in and when and what and how and who and so on. And I'd like to try to approach that question a little bit later on. Right, so I'll leave you to mess about with those if you feel like it, and if you don't, meanwhile, we'll carry on. Now, look, I want to talk to people who do the observations. That is, not the peer observations. That's slightly different, although peers do come into this, of course. But really, my rhetorical questions are directed at those who observe. That is, the directors of studies, the manager, the senior teacher, all those people who purport to know what they're talking about. Who are you to observe? Are you a master teacher? Who gave you the title? Are you an ELT guru? Are you an Adrian Underhill of ELT? Are you a font of knowledge? Do you know all there is to know about teaching? Or are you just an ordinary Joe? In the nicest possible way and with the greatest respect, I direct these questions at you, but I also direct them to myself. They are, of course, somewhat ironic questions, and yet they're worth asking, since if we observe, we're taking on the mantle of somebody who knows something. That's how it works at the moment. We're saying, basically, I know about this stuff, and I'm going to come and look at you and tell you how to make it better, right? Is that fair? So my next question really is designed to stimulate some questioning in what we should do with feedback. What should teachers do with feedback? Should they emulate, that model where an observer says, this is how you need to do it. This is the kind of tone of voice you should use when you're asking those questions. That's emulation. Or your body language. Look, why don't you stand like this? Why don't you move to the board like that? All that stuff. Should we change our beliefs as teachers? We get feedback and we're told, no, this doesn't work anymore. It's not like that. Therefore, should we change according to what the observer has told us or is telling us? Should we challenge? Should we say, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I think you're wrong. I've been doing this for 35 years. Okay. Well, should we comply? Should we quietly get on with what they've asked us to do? Or should we ignore it? Should we say to ourselves, look, this bloke, well, this person doesn't really know what they're talking about. I'm just going to ignore it. I know better. If I had a dollar or a pound or something for every time teachers have said to me, this is what I do and it really works, I'd be a rich man, but I'm not. So let's dig in a bit and ask who performs observations and why do they do it? People who observe are, for example, researchers. I mean, I've watched classes and recorded them with permission, of course, and I've still got those recordings, very, very useful. So for researchers who are investigating something, perhaps to do with language, perhaps to do with teaching or learning, whatever, but differently from other kinds of observation, they're not there to criticize you, at least not to your face, certainly. They may do it in their research paper. But they want a fuller understanding of something. So supervisors, that is, directors of studies, managers, and so on, who want to check quality, that's one reason that they might do that. Supposedly to check what's really going on in the classroom. And they may also do it as a marketing device. So these people are seen in the classes, students see them, and they get the impression, rightly or wrongly, they get the impression that somebody somewhere is checking quality and making sure it's good. And then, of course, that becomes part of the marketing strategy if this is a private school or institute. And then we have peer observation, and that's to increase, supposed to be at least to increase the effectiveness of both parties. So you ask a colleague to come in, or a colleague asks if they can come in. They come in, they watch your class, and then afterwards they give you some feedback. You chat together about it. And that particular category is not one which is going to we're going to talk about very much today. And the last category is potential students, and sometimes students are either asked to sit in on a class or they are asked to sit in on a class, and that is to check suitability, to check level, and all those things. And we're not going to be bothering about too much about that today. I remember when I applied for a job as a principal of a school in Oxford, and the owner of the school asked me to go and watch a few classes, which I did. One of the teachers in one of the classes got up and walked out when I went in, even though he knew I was coming. I just thought, left me to run the class, basically. Yeah. Anyway. I'd like to spend some time looking at some of the slightly technical aspects of observation in terms of how the literature has developed ideas around observation. And there are three main systems, if you like, or types of observation. The first one is systematic. Then we have ethnographic, and then we have something called ad hoc. And I'm going to explain it. This may seem a little bit technical, but perhaps unnecessarily technical. After all, we're just talking about someone watching a teacher do their job. But I think that if we can understand the jargon and the background, we might get to understand how we got to where we are. So bear with me as we examine these categories briefly, or you could have a nap if you prefer and come back in a few minutes. In fact, I think that's what I'll do. So the first one is systematic. Now, systematic observation has fixed categories or foci. That's the plural of focus, by the way, I discover. It's considered to be objective and reliable. It's quantifiable. It's impersonal. So we're talking really about, when the observer's coming with the clipboard and they have all those fixed categories and they're sitting there ticking things off. That's what's going on here. That's systematic. The problem with it, or one of the problems, actually millions of problems, but one of the problems with it is that there's a risk of overlooking other essentials. So you're looking for and talking about what you've got on your bit of paper, and you can miss other things, other important things. Now then, systematic approaches have been developed by Sinclair and Coulthard, models of classroom discourse. These are all things that you can look up if you're interested enough. John Fanslow, of course, focus. These are examples of a systematic approach. Likewise, the Ned Flander FIAC system, 10 categories and tally marks to record behavior. And Moskvich, who is famous for caring and sharing in the foreign language classroom, more detailed than Flanders. And in a sense, you might argue, if you know her book, you might argue that it's a bit strange that she's using a systematic approach, whereas in other areas of ELT, she's known to be much more kind of humanistic and much more flexible and open to different ideas. Anyway, so it should be clear that many have tried to create order and logic in observation systems. Here's what Richards says. The mechanistic model, with its assumption that planning equals teaching equals learning, simply does not match the reality, which is that planning, teaching, and learning are complex, multi-dimensional activities. And that is Richards' Beyond Training from 1998. I couldn't agree more with this, but strangely enough, although it was written a long time ago, 1998 is quite a long time ago. And yet the argument or the debate is still very much active. In fact, perhaps I'm making it active by talking about this now and not simply accepting the models that we have since been lumbered with. So let's move along. The ethnographic systems comprise more flexible categories for the observer to access. They can be responsive to the needs of the context, whereas the systematic approaches generally don't. And they are kind of long term. In other words, these observations which work under the ethnographic system are generally not changed. They generally remain the same. But the initial categories are flexible. Does that make sense? So initially, you can decide what it is you want to look at, alone or together with your teaching colleagues. And therefore, they can be responsive and descriptive. But in general, they don't change. And the reason for that is that they can be reviewed, that you can go back over to see what, how you've developed in a sense. The problem with, or one of the problems is that there's a huge investment to create the categories that you're going to look at, examine, and one asks, well, is it you're investing a lot? Is it worth it? Is there not another way to do it? That's one of the questions that I want to approach today. On the other hand, the ad hoc system. The ad hoc system is more or less specific to that teacher in that class with those students. So what we're saying really is that it's kind of context specific. So these are things which have been agreed beforehand. It's collaborative, it's eclectic, it is labor intensive and it is non-transferable. Well, I sit down with the teacher and I say, okay, what are we going to be looking at today? And the teacher says, well, I'd like to look at this, 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 and this. And I say, okay, that's fine. What about that? And she says, yeah, we'll do that as well. And so it's specific to that teacher in that context, that class, in fact. And there we have the risk of wokeness. So you could be accused of being woke because you're, in a sense, you're being aware of what that teacher needs to manage her particular teaching strategy. But, that's what I'm promoting in a way. I'm promoting the idea, which is that we're informed and collaborative and aware. And so in my book, we're moving in the right direction. So that's the ad hoc. Those are the three systems that we're going to look at, which come from, if you like, come from the literature. Now, this, you might say, oh, I wonder who said that. And of course, you'd be absolutely right to ask who said this. For teaching observation to be useful, it must be consistent, generative, and productive. This just sounds like a very wise piece of, a very wise quote from some ELT sage in the industry. Actually, it's only me. This comes from me. It's what I think. So let me see if I can unpack this consistent, generative, and productive quote, seeking coherence. So consistency means that the values remain the same. We don't ask more of one teacher than we might ask of another. Generative means that the result of such observation creates something. It inspires movement and action. And productive means that the work we put in, the work we invest, involves everybody, and it leads to something. It actually doesn't stop there. So if you recall back at the beginning of this presentation, I asked what teachers are supposed to do with the feedback they get from observation, and one of the answers was perhaps to ignore it. And this is what I'm saying here, that that's absolutely not what should be happening. Other things can happen and should be happening. So to discover how we've got here, we've got to ask us, I think we have to ask a series of questions. These are possibly deep philosophical questions about whether language teaching is art or science, but I won't take up too much of your time. If language teaching is science, then it's replicable. This is part of the definition of science, isn't it? It's measurable and it's observable. If it's art, then it's expressive, personal, and open to interpretation. So, fair enough. What if it's a mix of both? Well, if it's a mix of both, and I can hear the echoes of teachers past saying, of course it's a mixture of both, and not everybody thinks that. But if it is a mixture of both, if it's a combination, then we should be able to observe the balance. We perhaps should be able to adjust the balance even. Now, let's look in more detail at the various components of teaching. There aren't very many. Syllabus design perhaps is the first. I mean, even if you're a coursebook writer, that's the kind of syllabus, isn't it? Is that science? If it is, how do we do language sequencing? Why aren't all coursebooks the same? Or, well, they almost are, but we could say, well, language sequencing must be the same because it's a scientific endeavor. Lexical, grammatical, functional, notion. There should be only one course book, actually, shouldn't there? Because we don't need more than one. If syllabus design is science, then we've knocked it on the head. We've got it sorted. And learning outcomes should be very, very clear and consistent across the board, right? But a syllabus is just a guide, isn't it, for a sensitive teacher? I don't think many teachers these days follow a simple syllabus word for word unless they're forced to. And then we get complaints on social media groups saying, I have to go through the syllabus and I don't want to. And they're right. You shouldn't have to. Of course you shouldn't. Right. Next, we're looking at planning. Is that a science? If it is, then you never divert because it's laid in stone. It's written, isn't it? The ideal components and the staging are all there. We shouldn't have to worry about it. Should we? In fact, you probably don't need any training as a teacher to deliver this stuff to, or to plan a lesson at least. One size fits all. You and I know that isn't the case. It never has been, never will be. And then this is the big one, the delivery part. So we've looked at syllabus design, we've looked at lesson planning, and now we're looking at actually at the chalk face. Is delivery science? If it is, then there should be a universal style within a methodology, a unified treatment of error. Good luck with that. Identical teacher performance and student reaction. We know that none of that is true. We know that none of that happens. It isn't like that, is it? So we also know, or I hope we do, that science can assist rationalization. It can explain stuff. And we know that a lot of linguists, applied linguists, produce materials, produce papers which are useless to the teacher because they don't speak the teacher's language. But we also know that some of what is extruded from those ivory towers can be useful to us. But the reality is there's little evidence for most of what we do. What I'm saying really is that we don't really know what we're doing. We haven't got all the answers about language learning. Take, for example, the idea of the good learner and the good teacher. I mean, the studies on the good language learner are few and far between. They're enormously difficult. I mean, I can't remember the date. I think I should have looked it up, shouldn't I? 76, was it? Or 72, something like that. The language, the big Joan, sorry, can't remember. Never mind, doesn't matter. Anyway, the point I'm making is that the studies on these things are very, very difficult, and there are not many of them, perhaps because they're very, very difficult. There's a lot of distance between views. Now, technical know-how and a personal interpretation seems to define, in a sense, what a caring or a sensitive practitioner should be. That is somebody who knows what they're doing. That's the technical know-how part. And they also have an ability to interpret whatever it is that the science has told them. Caring practitioner, yeah. Now then, look, this is where we started. These are the words in red are the ones I want to pop back to because we're talking about clinical supervision, systematic, analyzed or analytical, and evaluated. Evaluated. Right, let's look at this. Clinical. Definition of clinical is detached, cold, distant, irrefutable, and proven. But shouldn't observation be a human activity engaging with another human activity? I'm watching you, but you're busy with your students. That's the beginning. It's a human activity or two human activities, isn't it? And then we have the word supervision. This is the act of overseeing or of supervising. Control, governance, regulation. Governance, regulation. I feel I should stand to attention or something. But support, guidance, development, and recognition must be where we should be. Isn't that right? Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point in having somebody supervising, controlling, regulating, if there's no support, guidance, development, and recognition? So look, what I want to offer is an almost complete reversal of all of this stuff, and to convince you and anybody else who will listen that we need to turn the whole shebang on its head. Here's the paradigm I want to promote. So instead of clinical, I want personal. Okay? This is how it's going to go. Instead of systematic, I want random. Now I can hear you squirming in your seats. Some people won't like that. But give me a moment to try and explain what this really means. Objective sounds good, but I'm looking for subjective. Evaluative? No. Supportive. connected with student outcomes, that, well, they say, that's why it's in red, they say that this clinical supervision is connected with student outcomes. But I want to connect with student outcomes in a completely different way, to actually connect with student outcomes. So here's what I mean in terms of practical alternatives. I want to talk about free observation. This is a change of culture. This is pop in, pop out. This is get involved. This is become a resource. Instead of sitting at the back with a clipboard, engage with students, help the teacher, talk to students, basically get involved. And in the feedback session, find out what the context is. Why was that person doing that? I mean, I've trained teachers to observe, and 9 times out of 10, when they begin the process of training to observe, they don't discover the context. And so they can be launching themselves down a path which is completely erroneous. This is not what the teacher wanted to do. And sometimes the teacher will pull them back and say, well, that's not what I wanted to do. But actually, sometimes they won't, because they're frightened. They don't want to be seen to be disagreeing. Discuss what you noticed, not tell. The word tell doesn't appear in here. Engage in dialogue. Let's have some snapshot comments. This was interesting. Why did that happen? Create a portfolio. That's for the teacher, really. And make this ongoing. Now, these are 2 approaches to observation which I've noticed. I don't think you'll find these in the literature, but the things that I've noticed about 2 different ways to conduct observation. The first is see what you say. Now, this is a list of behaviors and tick boxes. In other words, you're looking for and looking at the things that you've decided you're going to look at, right? And the second one is say what you see. So that is when you go in a sense with an open mind. You observe and report. And I don't need to tell you which one I prefer. This is to say what you see is far more. It's far broader and more inclusive. So the free observation model, it should be offering genuine support. It should be encouraging dialogue. It is a more humanistic option. And that, of course, means that the subject is central. It's answering a real need for practitioners, I think. Those teachers who have ever felt frightened because they're going to be observed, or frightened during observation, or frightened during feedback, or after feedback, or before feedback, this tells me there's a need for a review, a revamping of the whole system. And you will have realized by now that this is a complete departure from the traditional models of supervision, of clinical supervision. We're encouraging and we're allowing and encouraging a lack of rigor. And that's because we don't really know what we're doing. So I've already explained that there are huge gaps. We know some things don't work. We know that beating your students isn't going to make them learn better. So there's some stuff that we know, but there's a lot that we don't know. And that's what I mean by encouraging a lack of rigor. Let's become more human and humane. Now, my system, or is it a system even? Is it just a collection of ideas? A philosophy of observation, perhaps, rather than a system, is directly connected with student outcomes, since we're responding to or with the teacher who is responding to or with students. And I don't know how many times I've used this quote from Rod Ellis, who was one of the tutors on my MA years ago. I was very, very lucky to have him. So let me use one of my favorite quotes from Rod Ellis, who I was fortunate enough to have as a tutor on my master's many years ago. And it goes like this: what is learned is controlled by the learner, not the teacher, not the textbooks, and not the syllabus. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. What is learned is controlled by the learner, not the teacher. So it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're lucky and skillful, you'll have an impact. But it's not automatic. So you're not directly in control of what's happening, what the learner is doing, and neither is the textbook and certainly not the syllabus. This is 1993. It's going a long way back, isn't it? And it was in English Language Teaching Journal, the ELTJ. And yet, we should have this in every classroom, really, shouldn't we, on the wall, to remind us. There is one area of agreement, I think, and that is the importance of affectivity. So I'm talking about what we do and don't know. And we know, I think by now, that affectivity is an essential component of good language learning. So we know that if the environment is not comfortable for learners, then they're less likely to learn, right? So let's end the whole idea of observation being evaluative. Jack Richards, again, the observer should remain an observer. An observer cannot observe effectively if participating in the lesson. I'm sorry, but that's simply nonsense. Sorry, Jack, it's just not true. We're not watching some religious ceremony, although it is true that teachers very often see their classrooms as being some sort of cathedral, some sort of church or chapel, and the place upon which they work is their altar. But let's throw that away because it's rubbish. It simply isn't like that. It shouldn't be like that. Let's agree that what we're watching is something which we can get involved in. This is the other thing I want to have a go at. This is not about a special event. We don't have to bring out the best cutlery and the best tea cloth, tablecloth. It's not a special event. It's a unique event, because if you do page 32 of Headway 1 with 70 different classes, it'll always end up differently, right? Do you agree? So it's a unique event, not a special event. And as the observer, you shouldn't be the spotter of errors, but an informed, alternative perspective. So I'm arguing for informed subjectivity over objectivity. Preconceptions threaten objectivity. So if we are already decided in our minds that there's a way to work, this is a threat to that objectivity, which is so prized. And that's why there are so many systems, because they're designed to take away all those choices so that we're focused, really, like a horse's, what do you call those things that a horse wears? Start from looking at other people, other horses. That's what they exist for, those things. So we're measuring teacher-student behaviors in those systems, but what about mood, atmosphere, and interpersonal reaction? Where is all that? We've got tick boxes to say that there's a system which will allow an observer to say how many times students smiled or laughed. But what about the mood, the atmosphere, and interpersonal reactions? What about the way that the students are interacting together? How do we measure that? Suggest that we probably can't measure it, but that instead we gather a kind of an impression, if you want. And that is certainly not objectivity, but it is what I'm going to call informed subjectivity. So let's move on to feedback. You know, where the observer sits down with the teacher and gives them a list of stuff they did wrong, that thing. You did this, you did that, you did that, you didn't do this, you should have done that. Why did you do that? You shouldn't have done it. So what do you want to achieve? What do observers want to achieve in and through feedback? Are observers actually getting anything out of this thing, or are they doing it because they've been told to? And what about the observees? I'm not even sure that that's a word, but if it isn't, I've invented it now. What do you, as a teacher who's been watched, want to achieve in and through feedback? Right, let's just take a few minutes here. If your surname begins with between A and M, I want you to decide on 2 or 3 adjectives which should be applicable to the feedback process. If your surname begins with A, between A and M, that's your job. And if your surname begins with something with a letter between N and Z, decide on 2 or 3 adjectives which should not be applicable to the feedback process. So what I'd like you to do then is to just write those adjectives in the chat box if you could, so that people can have a look and think about them. So summing up, really, I'm proposing some humanistic notions of process over product, which I think is quite an interesting one for teachers in any case, because the whole process, very often we're focused on the product. We have to get learners to B2 in 8 weeks or whatever it is. But what we should be, I would argue, looking at is the process. And that's applicable here too. What is observation and feedback doing? What is the process achieving? What is the process in terms of within itself? What is it achieving? The final result is the product. So perhaps you're going to get a more informed teacher, a more sensitive teacher. I don't know, but I'm interested in how we get there. We're looking at the whole over the discrete, of course. So we're looking at, well, it's not always true, actually, but we're looking in general at the whole picture. In order to look at the whole picture, sometimes we also have to look at tiny little pieces, because sometimes those tiny little pieces will give us a clue as to how we got this result in the whole. Environment over technique and learning over teaching. I mean, it was going way back to Caleb Gatenio of Silent Wave fame, who said, the importance is the subordination of teaching to learning. In other words, put teaching down and bring learning up. And we're still saying that. Of course, we're still saying it because it's really important. Learning over teaching. So I'm arguing for abandoning traditional practice for risk-taking, cumulative benefits, and reciprocal dialogue. Risk-taking applies to both the teacher and the observer. Cumulative benefits means that benefits build up over time, and that also, I think, applies to both parties in this human activity. And a reciprocal dialogue means a toing and froing, not somebody telling somebody else something and not allowing for any comeback. But there are, of course, some possible problems. I'm arguing for an open door policy, you might recall, going back a little way. So what problems could you predict if teachers open their classroom doors? This is not really for now. This is stuff which I would invite you to have a think about and perhaps even experiment with to see what really does happen. I'm talking about physically opening classroom doors. This is not some sort of a metaphor. This is actually opening your doors. And can you perceive of any advantages if teachers open their classroom doors? Is there anything that strikes you immediately and you can say, well, I'm sure that this is an advantage if we do this? Because I reckon that most people who haven't done this, haven't used this system, can predict the problems. But can you also predict advantages to having an open door policy? And what arguments would you use to convince a colleague who's in favor of a traditional model? So I suppose what I'm asking really is, have I convinced you, or were you already convinced to change this traditional model? And if so, what would you say to somebody who isn't here today, who hasn't seen this, hasn't thought about it, and believes that the traditional model of suffering and suffrage, suffering is, we've always done it like, that argument. We've always done it like that. It's the way it is. Yeah. And then finally, if observation is less evaluative and more supportive, make a list of the teaching areas you would hope for help with. This is something for you to go away and think about. What would I like to get help with on the basis that my observation and feedback is going to be not evaluative, but much more supportive? So thank you very much for watching.